Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent, Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Tonight, folks, a very special show, a very different show than you're used to with Night Fright. That'll become more evident as we get into the story. Tonight we're going to be looking at a book called Contact Charlie. Our guest tonight is out of Toronto. His name is Chris Wattie. Now, let me just delve into this. This is a story of our troops in Afghanistan, 2006. I'm going to quote from the book right away. Before he could make a move, MacDonald heard Hamilton shout for help. He turned to the other soldiers firing from the scant cover of the building and told them to prepare. Put fresh mags in your weapons and put a fresh belt on the machine gun because they're coming. MacDonald told them grimly. I've got to go help with the other guys. With that, MacDonald took a running leap through the doorway and scrambled around the wall and across the open ground between the buildings. As bullets whizzed past from every direction, MacDonald dove headfirst into the second outhouse and landed on Hamilton's shattered foot, prompting an outburst of swearing from the captain. MacDonald put a tourniquet on the captain's leg to staunch the blood flow and a field dressing on his shattered foot, apologizing the entire time for taking him so long to get to him. Sorry it took so long, Hammy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry. The stocky sergeant had been living and fighting alongside Hamilton for more than 5 months, and the thought of letting down his captain when he had been wounded was almost too much. Don't worry about it, Willie. You didn't take that long. It was only a few minutes, not even 2 minutes, he said. Hamilton let go. Besides, I knew you'd come for me. That's what we're looking at tonight, folks. Our own guys in the heat of battle in Afghanistan. 18 Canadians held off 200 Taliban. We're going to tell that story tonight with the fellow who was embedded with the troops, Chris Wattie. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Welcome one and all, I'm Brent Holland. Welcome to Night Fright. Tonight, a very special show, a very unique show, a very different show for Night Fright. We're going in a different direction tonight. We're going to be talking about Canadian troops in the middle of battle in Afghanistan 2006, where 18 of our fellow neighbors, virtually neighbors folks, held off 200 Taliban and some say saved the whole mission right there in Afghanistan. I want to welcome Chris Wattie to the show for the very first time. Thank you, Chris, for joining us, and thank you for this incredible book.
Oh, you're welcome. And Brent, you know it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, my friend. And your check's in the mail for seeing that, by the way. I think I've got your wrong address, though, because it seems to bounce back. No, I'm kidding. Chris, you were embedded with the troops. Is this what led you, and I know you're a part-time reservist as well, I guess what I want to try and get across tonight is the fact that we're able to have a show like this. I'm able to drink a cup of coffee in my McGill cup for one reason only, and that is guys like you and guys like our neighbors go out there and put themselves on the line, and some of them don't come home, folks. Can we talk about what got you involved in writing this book and got you embedded in Afghanistan? I mean, did you ask for that assignment, or did you just up and volunteer to go?
I volunteered for it. It had been the second time I'd done it. I had been embedded before when the Canadian troops were in Kabul, and I was working for the National Post at the time. And the chance came up, and I jumped at it because my experience with the soldiers in Afghanistan had previously been so great. But I was completely unprepared for what what was going to happen, what I was going to see, and that was obvious almost right from the start. That just the level of, well, frankly, violence and danger that they found themselves in, and periodically me as well. It was immediately apparent, almost as soon as you get off the plane in a place like Kandahar, and became very quickly apparent to the soldiers. This wasn't a peace support mission. This was combat.
Precisely. And that violence escalated completely in 2006. You say that perhaps our Canadian troops were a bit surprised by that, but when I look at fellows like Lieutenant Colonel Hope, Bill Fletcher, these guys have chutzpah galore. And chutzpah, folks, is a word that means, it's a Hebrew word that means, well, character, courage, balls, if I can get away with saying that on television. It is pure character, if you will. These guys were meticulous. Can we talk about Colonel Hope first? I'm going to set it up, explain a few of the characters, folks, then we're going to get Chris to take us right into that battle.
At the time I met him, he was the battle group commander. He was the commander of all the troops, the Canadian troops, on the ground. And he's now actually living in Kingston. He's been promoted to full colonel since.
Is he really?
Yeah, yes, and teaching at Royal Military College.
Sure.
He's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met in my life. Just to give you an idea what Ian Hope is like, he and I went on a couple of patrols together up north of Kandahar City, and I recall sitting in some desolate valley up in the Arghandab, just north of Kandahar, having a long discussion. I had just read a book about the Peloponnesian Wars in like 200 BC in ancient Greece. And I'd offered an opinion about it. I was telling Colonel Hope that. And I found out later that he had actually written his doctoral thesis, military history on this. And it became very apparent very quickly that I was talking to someone who knew a lot more than I did. And I remember sort of looking around me and shaking my head, but here we are literally in the middle of nowhere, in a place that looks like the view from one of the Mars rovers, for heaven's sakes, and having a discussion about Thucydides with someone who's obviously a lot smarter than me.
How about Bill Fletcher? Now, I understand Bill Fletcher was trained right here at the Royal Canadian Military College as well in Kingston.
Yes, he was. He's an RMC graduate. Bill Fletcher's a really interesting guy. He looks at him. He was a rugby player, and he looks like a rugby player. He's got a very short haircut. He looks like what guys in the Army call a hammerhead. You know, the sort of guy that would, shout and has a huge gun collection and take himself way too seriously. So he looks like the kind of guy that would just as soon break you in two as look at you. But he's just the nicest guy you could ever meet. He jokes at his own expense. But at the same time, he was, Ian Hope described him as, he's not the kind of guy to lead from behind. He's a kick down the door, throw in the grenade, and follow me, boys kind of leader, which he did a couple of times in Afghanistan. Yeah. But his troops just adored him. They just adored the guy.
Okay, I'm going to get you to take your microphone just about an inch from your face, if you don't mind. There you go. Folks, we're speaking with Chris Wattie tonight. www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. You owe it to yourself to buy this book and read it. Folks, this is a feature film. If we were in the United States right now, this would be Black Hawk Down. That's how the writing is. I'm turning a page. I was thinking of this before, Chris, and my heart's going ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And here I am sitting drinking a cup of coffee in my studio in nice, safe Kingston, and my heart's coming out through my chest. At the end of the book, you will want to stand up and put a Canadian flag outside and sing "O Canada," and justifiably so. Terrifically written. I was going to say you should win a Pulitzer for this, but different country. But absolutely, folks, without question, the writing is of that quality and the storytelling. What's more, I'm going to come back to this every time we stop. These are our neighbors. These are our folks out there putting themselves on the line day in, day out, and many don't come home. By the way, I want to dedicate this show When I was in Sudbury, I had befriended a very wonderful woman by the name of Wendy Miller. She had lost her son, Andrew Miller, the summer of 2010, number 149. He was a medic and he was killed by an IED. I want to just dedicate this show to him and his mom that was left. And if you have kids and you know what it's like to wake up on Mother's Day, moms, and have your son or daughter make you breakfast in bed, well, she misses that the most. Think about that for a second as we're sitting back here in your comfortable armchair listening to this show. Let's go back to Chris. Chris, can we talk about the buildup of the insurgents in Panjwayi? And I guess the best place to start is to start talking about the tete-a-tete, and I use that.
Yeah. That's a very good metaphor. And well, I'm very happy to hear you enjoyed the book. To be fair, Brent,
Yes,
I felt like I was just the stenographer, because what started me off writing this book in the first place was I was reading and hearing through the grapevine. You started hearing these stories, and I finally was reading some of the citations for the medals that the guys in Charlie Company were handed out, and I'm reading this and going, holy cow, this is incredible. I mean, I couldn't make this stuff up. Why am I not reading about this in the papers? And I started asking around, and the guys started telling me the stories. And that's all it took. I mean, half these guys, all they need is a captive audience, especially the ones from Newfoundland. That's all. Your problem isn't getting them to talk. Problem is getting them to shut up.
Don't pick on Newfies now. I'm a quarter Newfie.
No, far from it.
That explains a lot. When people look at the show, he goes, he must be from Newfoundland. Listen, my granddad was from the Rock, and he instilled a lot of great values in me, folks.
And frankly, I don't want General Hillier coming after me. So
another great Newfie.
He may be retired, but he's still a dangerous man. So.
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
But in terms of what was going on in Panjwayi, you remember this is back in 2006, and this is about the time the Americans were really ramping up in Iraq. And frankly, they saw Afghanistan as a sideshow. George W. Bush was still president, and they wanted to hand off the whole Afghan situation to the
NATO. Oh, you're busting up there, my friend.
Was the Canadians? We were the bridge. Yeah, we were the bridge between this handoff of the Canadians were the bridge between NATO mission and the American mission, and we were the ones that were, frankly, holding the line during that handover period to European NATO-based mission from the Americans. And if that relatively small group of Canadians hadn't been holding the line, if they hadn't managed to hold off the Taliban for 3-4 months, it's entirely possible NATO could have collapsed. Certainly, the Americans would have lost a lot of faith in it.
Very much so, because you mentioned the fact that the Americans were really tied down in Iraq, and they weren't putting much emphasis in Afghanistan at the time. And NATO, the rest of the NATO countries, with maybe the exception of a few, didn't seem that committed to putting their troops in harm's way. Even up to 2011, when our troops came home, they still didn't want to seem to pick up the slack in any sense. And the reason why I mentioned tete-a-tete, folks, is because earlier on, Colonel Hope had a tete-a-tete with the leader of the 10th Mountain Division, which isn't too far from here, actually, in Syracuse. His name was General Freakley.
General Ben Freakley, yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. When Colonel Hope mentioned the similarities between the 1968 Vietnam Tet Offensive and what was taking place at that point in Afghanistan, he got visibly upset. But I thought Colonel Hope's analogy of the Tet Offensive was bang on. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the background of the Tet Offensive, what the Viet Cong hoped to achieve during that, which was more of a propaganda victory rather than a battle victory, and the same thing that was taking place in Afghanistan at the same time.
Yeah, sure. I'm terrible with dates, but sometime in the 1960s.
68.
68. Yeah, the North Vietnamese decided that they were going to mount an all-out offensive, and throughout all of southern Vietnam and along the border with between North and South Vietnam, regular forces, Viet Cong insurgents, all of this. At one point in downtown Saigon, they managed to get fighters inside the U.S. Embassy. It was just a huge chaos. Now, at the end of the day, militarily, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese lost thousands of men. It was militarily, like in a purely tactical sense, it was a disaster for them. But in terms of propaganda, the images on American TV screens were of fighting actually in Saigon, convinced the American public that, oh my gosh, what we've been told by our leaders that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are on their heels here, and here they are attacking the U.S. Embassy with the most heavily fortified building in downtown Saigon. Now, the Taliban, say what you will about the Taliban, and I tend towards General Hillier's view as detestable murderers and scumbags, but they aren't stupid, and they know the value of a good propaganda victory. Their plan, as far as anyone can tell, they knew that this switch was coming between the Americans and the other, mainly European nations in NATO. They knew that there was friction between the Americans and, say, the French and the Italians and the Germans, and they saw that as an opportunity to get rid of, to isolate the United States from all of their allies, including Canadians and the Brits, and by scoring the same kind of propaganda victory. Their plan was to go into the city of Kandahar, which is the capital of the province where the Taliban was created, storm in, take over some sort of high-profile building, either the police headquarters or the governor's palace in Kandahar, run up the Taliban flag and make sure the media cameras were watching it, and of course all the people that were involved would die, but that didn't matter to them. The important thing was the message that would be received in Europe and North America on our TV screens, and they came very close to succeeding.
Very much so, except for our Canadians. And folks, just imagine that in 2006, there were so many people against us going to the war in Afghanistan, and still, and that's their right. I'm not questioning that. But if they had have seen something like that taking place right on screen, they would have just said, oh, we should pull our troops out, it's a waste of time, and that would have been it. We would have collapsed in Afghanistan, and that would have been the end of the mission, and everything else that all the positive things that followed therein after. We're talking about Chris Wattie's book. It's called Contact Charlie. You are indeed listening to Night Fright, watching Night Fright right across the country. Now, it's a little bit of a different show for us. It's a direction I want to take the show in, as well as the paranormal. And I have to give cause to this, because most people tune in, of course, to hear paranormal stories or conspiracy stories. This is neither, but this is a damn good story, and it's one that it's exhilarating. It's exquisitely written. It will have you virtually unable to put the book down. I have read the book 3 times now, and much to the chagrin of my honey, I've been up late at night reading the book, and as I said, my heart was beating, even though I knew the outcome. I had read the book several times. Now, what's important here, folks, these are our neighbors. These are everybody's son, everybody's daughter that went over to Afghanistan to fight on our behalf, so we could have a show like this and watch a show like this from the comfort of our own homes. And we have to give full kudos to those who have fallen as well. Okay, so we had this tete-a-tete with the general of the 10th Mountain Division. He seemed to snub off the information coming in from Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Hope, to the effect that he had another mission he wanted to send them off on, and it was kind of, Colonel Hope kind of felt that essentially it was coming from a Canadian and it wasn't really taken seriously. They were, I think the quote is, they were seeing ghosts in the dark, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. As it turned out, nothing could be further from the truth. Can we talk about what happened to the Special Forces unit that was sent in from the Americans, and how the Canadians pulled those guys out as well?
Yeah, actually, the sense in the American command, because remember, the overall command at this stage, we would have been talking about May or June in 2006. The overall commanders were Americans, and there was a tendency, particularly for General Freakley, to look down their nose a bit at anything other than U.S. troops. they frankly thought the Canadians were imagining things. And wouldn't listen, and it was being dismissed, and no, they're just overreacting, they have one contact. Until finally, Colonel Hope got called into a briefing with General Freakley, unrolled a map. It was literally, it just come out from a firefight, rolled out a map and said, "Sir, we had contacts here, and he pointed all these places in the map. That's not one small group of people hopping from one place to the other, that's a lot of Taliban." And until then, the Americans didn't really believe him. And shortly after then, they had sent in one of their special forces team, I believe it was Delta Force, to go in and capture what they call an HVT, or high value target, in a compound in the Panjwayi. Well, the Americans were fixated. They thought the Taliban were up in the mountains hiding out, and Colonel Hope and the Canadians were trying to tell them, no, they're coming down into the Panjwayi, which is this valley just outside Kandahar city.
They're grouping there.
Yeah, they're massing for some sort of attack, and Colonel Hope thinks, and I believe him, that it was this high-profile propaganda attack on Kandahar city. Well, they sent in Delta Force on an unrelated mission, and they frankly stuck their extremities into a meat grinder. They lost some guys, and they had to get extricated by the Canadians. They went back to Bagram, which is a huge base near Kabul, where all the headquarters for all of Afghanistan was. And they said, the Canadians aren't imagining it. There really is. You got a problem, and you got to do something about it. Up until then, which was maybe about 4 months into the mission, the Americans just hadn't believed them. It was only by about July of 2006 that they actually realized that there's something going on. There's a problem here.
And I don't mean it, folks, to sound like, that stereotypical snobby Americans. That's not what I meant. There's many cases in this book, Contact Charlie, where the American soldiers fight side by side with the Canadians and bleed just the same red as our Canadians do. Many, many cases of that happening. It just happened to be this one general that, I don't know, maybe he had his nose at a joint, and I'm sure he's a great general. I'm sure his men look up to him, but in this particular case, he should have heeded the call, and he didn't, for a variety of reasons, and that's the point I was trying to make. Chris, can we talk about now the operation in the mountains that the Canadians were sent on? Was called Operation...
it was Mountain Thrust.
But they had
Operation Mountain Thrust, yeah.
And they had a nickname for it. It was Operation No Nonsense or something like that.
Operation Waste of Time.
Waste of Time.
What was happening? All armies. Again, it's not necessarily that it was an American general. Armies are bureaucracies, essentially. Heavily armed bureaucracies, but bureaucracies nonetheless. And as anyone who's tried to deal with any federal department will tell you, getting things done sometimes take time and has to go through 5 or 6 channels, and it's a bureaucracy. And that's why you got this delay. Well, all armies, the truism is that armies fight the last war during the war they're in. So what the Americans were doing at that time was fighting the battles in 2002, when they'd been fighting the Taliban up in the mountains, Tora Bora, when Osama bin Laden escaped through their net. They thought they were still fighting that kind of war. The Taliban had shifted gears. They had decided that we're going to stop playing hit and run. We're going to stop hiding in the mountains. We're going to come down and mass our troops, because they saw an opportunity. They saw a weak link, and they thought the Canadians were the weak link. Fortunately, we had guys like Bill Fletcher, Ian Hope, and all the guys in that battle group, and it's interesting. It's come to the point where now, I think it was about a year ago, one of the senior Taliban commanders was being interviewed by one of these jihadist websites, and he was asked at some point. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but he was asked at some point what he thought of the soldiers in the coalition, and he was very dismissive. Oh, they're all cowards. They just use airstrikes and artillery, and they hide behind this. But, they fight very cowardly. Then he pauses and he goes, "Except for the Canadians, they're good fighters."
It's nice to know we made his bottom end pucker. How's that for?
Yeah. Well, they earned a certain amount of grudging respect, because our boys really know their business, and the Taliban, a lot of Afghans have been fighting wars since about the mid-'70s. They know good soldiers when they see them.
I want to bring up a couple of points that you just made. The fact that we seem to be, after 2002, always on the defensive. We were basically reacting to an action that the Taliban had taken, except in certain cases with the Canadians where we actually went out on ambush patrol. In other words, turning it around, not just running down a main highway with a bunch of LAVs. We actually went out in the paddies and setting up ambushes, waiting for the Taliban. And I was wondering if we could talk about Jurkowski, I hope I have his name right, first Canadian ambush patrol since the Korean War. Could we talk just a little bit about that? This book, just let me tell, I'm so excited about this book. You got to go and buy this book. This is our guys, folks. Canadian, contact Charlie. It's all Canadian troops fighting there on our behalf. If, as I said, if this was an American book, it would have been optioned by now, and Spielberg or somebody would have made it into a Black Hawk Down with Ridley Scott directing it. Why it is just brushed over and our mainstream press hasn't even touched it, I don't know, and that's something we're going to address after as well. I don't know if it's Canadian apathy or what it is, but this is an exciting book. It is the true story with some casualties of our Canadian troops. Chris Wattie's our guest tonight on Skype via Skype from Toronto. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. Take you right to a spot online from the comfort of your own home, provided by these very troops, where you can order the book and just get it right away. It's a great book. And also, I never plug Chapters because I'm not supposed to, but this time I'm going to. I was at Chapters last night in Kingston, and it's readily available. Get the book. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, listen, I sent you a $10 check before for mentioning me. Always great to talk to you. So now you can send me a $10 check back. I'm teasing you.
Yeah, you'll get a rebate for every mention, right?
There you go. Yeah.
But Ryan Jurkowski is a great guy. As it turns out, he and I had something in common. We're both Air Force brats, and our dads sort of know each other. So we ran into each other in Afghanistan. He was the second in command of Charlie Company, which is the Charlie in the title of the book.
And by the way, folks, Chris was stationed, actually, not stationed, but he was with his dad here in Kingston as well.
Yeah, I think it was about 5 years old. I might have gone to grade 1. I'm not sure. Anyway.
He remembers it fondly. Sorry. Okay.
I love Kingston. I always have. It's a great little town.
Beautiful.
It's a lovely town. They decided, Ryan Jurkowski had decided that enough of this. We aren't going to be on the defensive. And he actually told me in theater, when we were in theater, he said, look, these guys are used to fighting the Russians, or people who fight like the Russians. And what they don't understand, but they're about to find out, is that we don't fight like the Russians. I mean, the Russians have a very set series of ways of doing things. They have a very rigid system, right? The Canadians are encouraged to adapt and just make things up as they go along, and we're much more flexible. And what's more, we're not going to turn around and wait. I'll give you one small example of that. The typical on an ambush, the typical drill you're supposed to do is when you drive in, you realize someone's shooting at you from the side. The typical drill is supposed to be, what you're supposed to do is just drive forward as fast as possible and get out of their field of fire. What the Canadians decided they would do is they said, well, they don't really have anything that can do that much damage to us, and we have these big armored vehicles. So to the shock and horror of the Taliban who were ambushing it, what they started doing is routinely turning towards the fire and just start hosing down the area they're getting fired from. And the Taliban had, oh my goodness, no, we're not supposed to do this. The Russians didn't do this. So that was why he decided he was going to start sweeping these ambushers. He not only was he not going to start, he wasn't going to wait for them to ambush. He went out on foot and started sweeping back and forth, looking for the guys lying in ambush for the LAVs. And as he said, it was the first time since Korea that Canadian infantry had been out doing counter-ambush patrols, trying to ambush the ambushers. Now, they didn't succeed that particular night, but as soon as they got back in their vehicles, they got ambushed. Again, turned towards them and started firing. And after that first 2 or 3 nights, this group, which had been mounting ambushes on almost everything that moved up and down the main highway running through Panjwayi, activity dropped down to 0. And they had to pull out eventually and be sent somewhere else, and the ambushes started up again. So clearly offensive tactics, aggressive tactics, and very creative tactics by the Canadian Battle Group had the effect.
And folks, again, this book is full of these stories, heart-pounding stories where you're going to feel like you're right there beside our Canadian troops, right in battle. The book is called Contact Charlie. Our guest tonight, Chris Wattie, and I am excited about this book because it's the true story of our neighbors, our Canadian troops who just go right into battle head first so that we don't have to fight the Taliban here. And believe me, the threat is real. There was just a few weeks ago, attack thwarted that was supposed to hit the White House. There's no question the Taliban are living amongst us. I don't want you to go all out and go crazy now. It's not what I'm trying to instill in you, but I'm just saying that, the threat is real, and the fact that our troops go over there and put themselves in harm's way so I could drink my coffee out of my McGill cup tonight and talk with Chris. I just have to thank them from the bottom of my heart. Contact Charlie. Chris Wattie's our guest tonight. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. Take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Now, folks, if you're just joining us, we're just past the halfway mark. Settle in, relax, get the coffee going, as I always say, get the tea going, get a glass of juice going, or whatever type of beverage you would like. Put your feet up. This is your time to relax, and we're telling a wonderful story tonight about our Canadian troops in Afghanistan, 2006. Let me just read something from the book again, and this is from Contact Charlie, written by our guest tonight, Chris Wattie. I'm hit, he shouted. Fletcher, this is Bill Fletcher now. Bill Fletcher glanced over and realized that for once the young corporal who had been his shadow throughout the entire mission wasn't there. Mooney was on the ground. Now, Mooney is another newfie, and he was responsible for carrying the back sack with the big radio so that Major Fletcher could stay in contact with command. So Mooney was always shadowing him everywhere he went, because whenever Fletcher needed to contact and call in an artillery barrage or whatever, he needed that right away. So Mooney was on the ground shivering and staring at the growing pool of blood in his lap. Fletcher swore and grabbed his first aid kit, pulling out his belt knife to cut away Mooney's pants and find the source of the bleeding. Mooney looked up at Fletcher as the major cut away at his pant leg to expose the wounded leg. "Are they okay?" he asked after a moment. "What?" Fletcher answered, looking up at the young corporal's whitening features. "Are my boys okay?" I'm laughing. Mooney said, gesturing to his crotch. "Tell me my boys are okay." Fletcher rolled his eyes and sighed. He shook his head and gingerly lifted the blood-soaked patch of tan-colored clothing over Mooney's groin, still not quite believing he was checking his signaler's private parts. "I don't know, Mooney," he said after a pause. "Is it always this small?" Mooney made it, no problems. His boys were fine, by the way, folks. I won't hold you, but in battle, folks, there are many stories, and all these tiny little anecdotes make up this great, bigger story called Contact Charlie. The book by Chris Wattie, our guest tonight, www.nightfrightshow. Just click on the book cover. Get the book. Chris, let's go back now. I'd like to talk about Mike Dineen, and again, the chutzpah. There's that word again, folks, and I'll probably use that even more. When he broke his ankle, and he absolutely refused to get off the battlefield. Unbelievable.
Well, it's actually very common, and you go back and hear, like in the Second World War or the First World War, you'd find the same thing often happening. He didn't want to leave his guys. He felt responsible. He was a section commander with 8 corporals and privates under him. He didn't want to leave his guys. And even though he's walking, he describes walking around on an ankle that he's clearly really badly sprained at the very least. Actually, it turned out later they did X-rays at the end of the mission. It turned out he cracked some bones in it, and he didn't want to leave his guys alone. So he said, "Okay, I'm not going to get him to do the walking. I'm going to stay up in the turret in the vehicle." But Mike Dineen is one of these guys. You or I, when we realize someone's shooting at us, we'll do one of two things: freeze or turn around or run. And in my case, I'd scream like a little girl. Mike Denine is for that 2% of the population that when someone starts shooting at them, he turns towards the person shooting at them. You shoot at Mike Denine, you're just ticking him off. You know, and I don't know what it is about him, but and he's a wonderful guy, and he's just one of these sort of natural leaders that is just completely unfazed by bullets flying overhead, or indeed past his ears, as happened a few times.
Folks, we're talking with Chris Wattie tonight. Of course, we're talking about his book, Contact Charlie, 2006. 18 Canadians held off over 200 Taliban. Chris, I wanted to talk about the Taliban now. What kind of character makes up the Taliban? I had interviewed another Siberian, by the way, folks. His name is Ray Wiss. He was a Canadian doctor, front lines in Afghanistan, and he said he carried 2 bullets, one in his pocket and one in his vest, one for his rifle and one for his handgun. If he was ever taken by the Taliban, or about to be, I should say, he would have ended it for himself. Can we talk a little bit about what makes up the Taliban and why they are so feared by the population in Afghanistan?
Well, feared and hated for the most part, particularly in the north and the northwest of the country. Down around Kandahar in the south, where there's a lot of Pashtuns, they're slightly more popular, but you're still talking about fewer than 10% of Afghans. And believe it or not, they have actually done opinion polling in Afghanistan. The reason is because they remember the Taliban when they were in power. In the early 1990s, for almost 10 years, they ran the country, and they did such a bad job of it that they are almost universally despised, again, particularly in northern Afghanistan. It's easy to think of the Taliban as Mullah Omar, a group of religious fanatics, going back to the early 1990s, and they are all that. But there's many factions within the Taliban as well. It's a very disparate group, and I highly recommend the writings of Rashid, who wrote the book Taliban and the latest Descent into Chaos, which is about Pakistan's and its relationship with Afghanistan, because he describes what exactly goes on, what goes on in the internal workings of the Taliban. Basically, these guys want to turn the clock back to the late Iron Age. I'm not exaggerating.
No,
this isn't hyperbole. They really quite literally want to. Okay, maybe not the Stone Age, but certainly the late Iron Age. They are pure and simple religious fanatics. Now, having said that, there are a lot of groups attached to the Taliban who are under the broader umbrella of Taliban that are considerably less conservative, less. Or fanatical in religious terms. And when you hear often about negotiating with the Taliban and how the Karzai government's been trying to woo people away from the Taliban, generally speaking, those are the people they're talking about. The sort of, I don't want to call them fringe Taliban, but less hardcore Taliban. But again, as I said earlier, just because they're religious fanatics, just because they're murderers, it doesn't mean they're stupid. They may be primitive. They may be they may be want to turn half the world into a theocracy, but that doesn't mean they don't know. They aren't smart enough to mount a propaganda campaign, which of course they did and have been doing.
Chris? Do they work part and parcel with Al Qaeda? And if so, has the death of Bin Laden made any difference at all? I know it's kind of out of the scope of the book, but I'd just like to get your opinion on it, because I know you're right in the media as well.
Well, no, it's interesting that they had a very, when they were in power, between about early 1990s to 2001, where they're pretty abruptly ousted by the U.S., British, and incidentally Canadians were involved in that. They had a very parasitic relationship, I call it, with Al Qaeda. They needed Al Qaeda fighters and Al Qaeda money and Al Qaeda support to help them fight the rebel groups in the north. They couldn't survive without Osama bin Laden. You'll recall in just before the September 11th attacks, one of the main Afghan rebels was assassinated by an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber with a TV camera they'd used for a bomb. It's pretty much widely acknowledged that assassination was Al-Qaeda's paying the Taliban, doing the Taliban a favor because they knew September 11th was coming, 2001, so that the Taliban wouldn't turn around and hand them over. The Taliban could not have survived without Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda could not have survived and couldn't have planned the operations like September 11th without the support of the Taliban.
Yeah, that was, folks, just prior to September 11th. That was the Karamiz. He was a very popular, I can't get the word out, he was a very popular leader of the Northern Alliance. Which
the Great Masood.
There you go.
The Great Masood.
And you think I could remember his actual name, and I can't. And he was taken out, as Chris has just related to us. Now, so these are fanatical, which means they're going to fight to the death for the most cases. They're not going to take any prisoners. So this is something that I guess our troops had to be ready for and expecting. Which perhaps would give our troops that much more initiative to take the fight to them, I suspect. Now, can we go into the White Schoolhouse at this point? And I don't want you to give away the end of the book, but I guess I just want to set it up so people will actually go and get the book and get the end of the story, and just to tell what our Canadians were up against at this point, the 18 guys that held out, and take us into battle, I guess.
Well, they had Colonel Hope had finally convinced the Americans, and his own commanders, that they had a problem in the Panjwayi, this district, this valley just to the west of Kandahar city. It convinced them that they had a problem there, that they had a lot of Taliban, that they weren't there to collect the opium harvest, but they were there and they were up to no good, and we have to do something about this. So he sent in, on August 3rd, he sent two of his company groups, about 150 guys each, all told. There were two schoolhouses, which ironically had been built by U.S. aid. One of them was called the Yellow Schoolhouse because it was kind of beige to the north. He sent B Company. Charlie Company, he sent down to the White Schoolhouse. That's how they would distinguish them. They were fairly sure that these areas were being used by Taliban as sort of centers, command and control centers, if you will. In some cases, they're being used as like field hospitals. And on the morning of August 3rd, they rolled in. Now, in the Yellow Schoolhouse, they had a very sharp firefight, but they managed to surround and capture a fair number of Taliban. In the White Schoolhouse, they walked into a firestorm. They really didn't expect. I don't think they expected. I've heard estimates of over 1,000 Taliban there at one time or another. They really didn't expect that many there, which is why I think it turned into such a huge battle, a much bigger battle, I think, than anyone really expected.
And that's what happened, folks, and they held them off, and unfortunately there was many fatalities as well. And I just want to come back to that fact that, you know, the reason why we have a show like this is because of the courage and the sacrifice of those guys. Can we talk, it's kind of a segue into Nicole Godard as well, and she was the first woman combat, you know, and Mackenzie wrote me about this, and he gave me hell, and justifiably so, because they had buggered it up, and I think I'm going to do it again. She was the first combat qualified female fatality. Can we talk a little bit about Nikki?
Well, first of all, for heaven's sake, don't call her Nikki. Somewhere overhead, she's watching us, and something bad's going to happen. I knew Nicola. Everyone called her Nick. I accidentally called her Nikki once, and she pulled back her fist as if to punch me, and I flinched, and she just laughed and said, "Don't call me that." She hated being called Nikki. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. She was an artillery forward observation officer, fully qualified, aggressively competent. She was just a lovely young woman, and she was attached to Charlie Company, which is a little tough because she would have been about the only woman in a group of 147 or 48 testosterone charged young men. She managed to hold her own. She held her own. And the forward observer, I mean, her job is to go and call the shots, literally. She goes up and directs the fire of the artillery far to the rear. So she was always in the front line, always up near where the shooting was, because she had to see what was going on where the artillery shells were falling. And on May, in May, very early in the battle around the Panjwayi, unfortunately, she was up in her turret. She was hit by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. Her sergeant, who was right beside her, was badly wounded, and she was unfortunately killed. And I think she would have been the first Canadian combat casualty for some time. I know some Canadian nurses died during the Second World War, and I believe in the First World War, but I think she would have been the first Canadian female soldier, like combat soldier.
Combat qualified. That's what General Mackenzie wrote and told me, and he was justifiable in that. And I consider you a great man and a great friend as well, folks. We're talking about a terrific book, Contact Charlie. I can't say enough about this book, folks. This is an award winner, without question. As I say, if it was put out in the States, this sucker would have been Black Hawk down without a second thought. And because it's in Canada, I'm going to segue into why the media has passed over this story. But I want to tell you where you can get it. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. Take you right to a spot where you can order the book online, or just go down the chapters. It's readily available at Chapters without question. I was there the other night, and it's right there, folks. Won't have any problems getting this book. Our guest tonight is Chris Wattie, via Skype, of course, live from Toronto. Okay, what happened to the media? Why did they drop the ball again on our boys and women in Afghanistan?
Well, it's complicated. With the best intentions in the world, and I've spoken to some of my colleagues who've been over there. I mean, it's the media; we all talk to each other, and I've spoken to some of my colleagues, and unfortunately, embedding for a number of reasons, the whole embedding program has kind of lost its way. They've turned it's turned from an experience where we want to put reporters in the field of the soldiers to see what they do on a day-to-day basis, to see what they go through, share the dangers, and then tell the Canadian public, tell everyone back home. What it's turned into, fairly quickly, for a lot of reasons, which I'll go into, but what it's turned into is, frankly, a death watch. People go to Kandahar. Often they aren't qualified. Often there have been cases of City Hall reporters being sent over to Afghanistan, and frankly, they get scared, and I can't blame them. And if you haven't covered the military, or been exposed to the military, then you're in a completely strange and often quite hostile universe. At the same time, they've got editors in Toronto, usually Toronto, but back in Canada, saying, no, you have to stay on the base in case something big happens, right? Something big being code for another Canadian soldier dying. So what ends up happening is you have embedded reporters over there. They stay in the base in Kandahar. There are exceptions to this, I hasten to add. And they're just sitting there waiting for the next casualty, and which to me is, well, why didn't you stay home? Because you might as well have. Now there are exceptions. There are guys and gals who will get out and do it, but particularly since we lost a journalist in Afghanistan, that's been very, very difficult to do. Part of the blame, I think, is the media's. Part of the blame is, frankly, the government's, because the level of interference from Parliament Hill, which means Privy Council office, has been almost breathtaking. I've heard stories about interviews with sergeants. A reporter wanting to interview a sergeant going patrol, and it has to go back to Ottawa and be approved by Privy Council office before they let him go into patrol, and that's just ridiculous.
Absolutely. Now, do you think part of that is because of national security, if you will? Perhaps this story didn't get covered the way it should have because we didn't want to give away some kind of tactics or something along those lines?
No, we dealt with that sort of thing all the time, and it would just, those sorts of issues can be sorted out, and were for the the 3 times I was embedded over there. But I think what it is a government that's politically gun shy. Stephen Harper does not see this as his mission. He sees it as something that Paul Martin fobbed off on him, and and his office and his government is bound and determined to limit the amount of political damage it's going to take. They're trying to micromanage the mission. It's about the public relations. It's not about what's actually happening on the ground.
It's a damn shame, and our guys are over there losing their lives. Folks, we're talking about Contact Charlie, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. Chris Wattie's our guest tonight. Order the book. It's fantastic. Lasting legacy. It's 6 years later. Our troops have come home. We still have troops over there training, quote unquote. I suspect it's a little bit more than that. But certainly that seems to be the convention that's been given to the public. What's our lasting legacy?
Well, hopefully it's an Afghanistan that's a little more stable than when we arrived. Every time I went back to Afghanistan, I saw, you could see with your own eyes the improvements. The first time you go over there in 2003, Kabul was almost, parts of Kabul were a ghost town. You go back again, I went back again 2 years later, and there's bustling markets, construction everywhere. So there are a lot of positive things happening in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, you still have a Taliban insurgency for all sorts of reasons, not least of which Pakistan, refusing to play. That's going to be difficult to eradicate. I think the lasting legacy, though, there's a lot of Afghans that have been exposed to Canadians, to the Canadian way of doing things. Not just our military, I think mainly our military, but there's been a lot of Canadian aid workers. A lot of Canadians have been in Afghanistan, and I think one of the lasting legacies is going to be whoever runs Afghanistan, that Canadians have made a very good impression. The other interesting, and this is what I find particularly interesting, you'll recall the recent unpleasantness in Libya. There was absolutely no hesitation on the part of the government in joining that mission, and I think rightly so.
Agreed.
And when that happens, and when things happen in Syria, I don't think there'll be any hesitation or any particular outcry from the Canadian public or from the usual suspects, for lack of a better word. When's the last time you've heard someone refer to Canada's peacekeeping tradition? I think the one solid effect has been not just to the Canadian public, but also to all our allies, to all the guys in the Pentagon or number 10 Downing Street or in Horse Guards, that we're the Canadians mean business. We can rely on them. They're not they're not the French, frankly.
Ouch. Okay, fair enough. How has it changed you, Chris? You were embedded over there. You went back 3 times. How has it changed you?
I was surprised at how affected I was by some of the guys. This summer, I went out. I got invited out to Edmonton by most of the guys that I gotten to know. Willie McDonald, Hammy. All the guys invited me out. They had a sort of Task Force Orion reunion, and because I'd written Contact Charlie, and their reaction was so positive, and a certain amount of alcohol was being consumed at a bar, and Willie and Hammy put their arms around me and said, Chris, you're one of us now, and I got to admit, I got a little choked up about it. I think it's going to be impossible. And I like to think the reason I wrote the book wasn't, yes, we should be in Afghanistan, no, we shouldn't. The real reason I wrote the book is that no Canadian soldier or sailor or airman should go off to some godforsaken country, to some horrible situation, risk their lives. And it seems to me the very least we can do is pay attention to it. So let their stories be told. And that's another lasting legacy. I mean, you talk to Dr. Ray, he's certainly told his story. And there have been several books about Afghanistan, more and more of them coming from the soldiers. And I think that's... our soldiers, our military isn't going to suffer in silence anymore. People are paying attention now. And good.
Do you feel that the Canadian population was behind them enough? I don't. That's why. And I was just curious what your perspective is. During the conflict, do you feel that... I didn't feel like we were at war here.
Yeah, and I think there were elements of the Canadian government, the Canadian bureaucracy in particular, that really didn't like the idea of us being at war and wanted soft pedal it. I think, frankly, I'm surprised that the levels of support for the mission remained as high as they did. It was somewhere between 45 one way, 50-something another. It was very, very close. So the Canadian public was clearly pretty split on the Afghan mission. My surprise is, given that the government never really took on the job of explaining this, never really made a pitch for this mission, why we're there. Given the inaction by the government, I'm surprised that we got the levels that we were running levels of support in sort of the mid-40s.
You make a good point. A good point. I'm going to ask you a final question here, and then we'll wrap up. I had mentioned at the outset that a good friend of mine from Sudbury had lost her son, Andrew Miller. The woman's name is Wendy Miller. She runs a store. I won't mention the name of the store, but this is how I got to a clothing store for big guys. Let's put it that way. And a woman had come in just after she'd lost her son, had come in and said, "I'm glad your son is dead. He was a baby killer." How would you have responded to that woman? I know how I would have. I'd probably be in the penitentiary here. But how would you have responded to that woman?
Well, I'll do better than that. I'll tell you how a soldier I know served in Afghanistan got something like that. And I hasten to add, it's extremely rare.
Thank God.
When you go out in uniform, by and large, it's incredibly positive. You know, when people say something to you, they react very positively, which is great to see. You know,
Absolutely.
But the reaction I heard from a friend of mine who got called literally, quote unquote, a baby killer. His reaction, he just looked at the woman and said, "Not yet, but the day's not over," and walked away. Because what's he gonna do? Punch someone? No. He just said, "Hopefully, I gave her nightmares for the rest of the night." Yeah, there's always going to be people whose minds aren't going to change, who think that it's terrible that we're picking on the Taliban, who are just, freedom-loving, freedom fighters, and it's horrible that we're in bed with the U.S. about this. Well, there's always going to be a small minority of people, just like there's a small minority of people that think the learned elders of Zion, run the world, right?
The protocols of the Elden Zion, yeah.
I've got a copy somewhere too, but I think by and large, and this kind of gets back to your last point, I think one of the lasting effects of this whole mission is that the Canadian public is suddenly aware of what their soldiers go through,
yes,
and their sailors and airmen, and reacted the way most Canadians, I think, would. They have a genuine affection for these guys, even if they don't support the mission. And by all means, we live in a democracy. You're supposed to disagree with the government from time to time.
Dialogue.
And I understand there are good reasons not to support the mission. There are logical arguments. But even if they don't, that's nothing to do with the guys who are going over there.
We're a little bit late, but I want you to plug your next book anyways.
Well, it's funny. I just signed Contact Charlie. We just signed a deal to put out on ebooks. So there's going to be an electronic version coming out from an outfit called Iguana Press. Should be in the next month. And I am working on a book right now about the IED, the roadside bombs, the counter IED squadron. These are the guys who are the Canadian version of the Hurt Locker, only they don't like the Hurt Locker at all. But when you get to the real story of what these guys went through, what they did, the way they managed to defuse, they were fighting their own private little war with these Taliban bomb makers, and they won some and they lost some. But again, I had the same reaction. I think we're going to be seeing stories upon stories coming out of Afghanistan. There have been several books already, and again, I every time I talk to soldiers who've been over there, I say, "Good grief, I couldn't make this stuff up."
Yeah, folks, we've been speaking with Chris Wattie, an exceptional Canadian writer, without question. Once again, folks, this is a feature film in a nutshell. Contact Charlie is the name of the book. Chris Wattie is our guest tonight and writer of the book. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. Order this book. You'll be so proud of our troops, and your heart will be pounding on every page without question. I'm late. I've got to run. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you next time.